arugula, bok choy, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, collard greens, kale, kohlrabi, Napa cabbage, rutabaga, turnips, horseradish, radish, rocket, sweet Alysum, wasabi, watercress. What are we talking about this week, y'all? It's the first episode of this new little mini series on all of the different plant families, and we are kicking the series off with talking about one of my favorites. Okay, like you can't tell the plants that I have a favorite, but one of my favorites, if not my most favorite plant family, is the brassicas. Oh my goodness. Okay. So today we're going to talk all about the brassicas, or the Brassicaceae family. We're also going to talk about the term cruciferous. We're going to talk about how these little plants like to grow, when they like to grow, how you can identify a brassica plant, and so much more. We're also going to talk about, throughout the series, which of the different plant family members do really well in small spaces. And if a plant does well in a small space, then it'll do really well in a big space. So we're going to talk all about these little brassicas, why they're so great, why they're so tasty, and some specific growing information to get you ready for spring, because, spoiler, most brassicas grow best in the spring and fall. Yeah. So this little episode, like I said, is the first in a little mini series I'm going to be doing this month and next month to get us ready for the year ahead and all that we're going to grow. So without further ado, let's talk about the brassicas. Welcome to the Growing Space podcast. I'm your host, Farmer Erin, owner of the Patio Farmer, and I believe that no matter what size space you have, you can grow food at home. Tune in every Tuesday as I share my best tips, tricks, and encouragement for tending to homegrown edible plants. I'm here to support your food growing journey. The Growing Space podcast is sponsored by Plant Club by the Patio Farmer. Plant Club by the Patio Farmer is a monthly subscription service I started in 2020. It's a membership-based opportunity to take your growing journey to the next level. With 4 different membership options, you get to decide the amount and kind of support that's right for you. All Plant Club members receive access to my online community through a platform called Circle. Having access to this platform allows members to share pictures, ask questions, celebrate harvests, and get to know each other. All Plant Club members also have access to free seeds each month, along with information on how to plant and tend to their crops, with seeding instructions and downloadable resources from the Patio Farmer's Resource Library. Membership starts at just $14 a month. Join Plant Club today by visiting my website, thepatiofarmer.com/membership. The brassicas. Oh, I love these. Some of the most nutrient-dense plants that we can grow at home are these lovely plants. If you have been following me for any length of time, well, then you will know that I am a little bit of a greens fan. I love greens. I love them. I could easily make a brassica part of every single meal that I ever eat. I really just love them. And they're super nutrient dense and beneficial. They grow well at home when we cultivate them in our growing spaces. Okay, so the first thing to tell you about the brassica family is that these vegetables are also sometimes referred to as members of the mustard family, and they're also sometimes referred to as cruciferous vegetables. Now, if you have read through a newsletter or you listened to a previous episode of the Growing Space podcast, then maybe you heard me share that the members of this plant family all evolved from a single relative, and that relative is wild mustard. Yeah, throughout the millennia that wild mustard has been cultivated or just grown naturally, freely, wildly it has experienced these different evolutions and these different stages of adaptations and, being cultivated for different purposes. And through that process, we have gotten all of these different kinds of edible plants. This plant family of over 3,700 species. Oh yeah, 3,700 species of brassicas. Not all of them are edible. Let me just preface, they're not all edible. These plants are also referred to as cruciferous vegetables. And you want to know where that name came from? So it's derived from Latin because, of course, and cruciferous, its root word is the Latin word for cross or cruce. Brassicas are flowering plants. The term cruciferous comes from how their flowers are formed. Their flowers are going to have 4 petals on them, and they're going to be arranged so that they meet in the middle at like 90-degree angles. So when you look at the flower, you can see a cross in between each one of those petals. So there you go. That's where the term cruciferous comes from, is because of the formation of the flower of the brassica family. Now, when it comes to growing brassicas at home, a couple of things to just keep top of mind. For those of you who don't know, I am based in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is the hardiness zone 8. And so for us here, brassicas are going to grow best in the cooler weather. So spring and fall is the best time to be planting and growing members of this plant family. Ideally for spring, like if you get these planted in like early March, that would be ideal. You might be able, I say might because it depends on the weather. And this year, it might be mild enough to plant some in February. But usually like early March is the best time to plant for spring. And then for your fall crop, again, depending on your space and your plans for the fall season and how you're feeling towards the end of the summer, you can start planting your brassicas towards the end of August, but definitely by mid-September is when you want to have these plants planted. These plants, they are frost tolerant. They're kind of easygoing in that way because you don't have to worry like if temperatures are going to get below 32 degrees. You don't have to worry about covering these up. They're totally fine like out there in the cold, which to me is really lovely. When the brassica family is exposed to freezing temperatures, what happens is that the little plant cell walls break in the cold. That you can't actually see this, but the cell walls break, which sounds a little like ouchy. But what plants do in order to recoup from those minor breakages in their cell walls is produce sucrose. Now, sucrose, of course, is sugar in plant form. And so in doing this, it actually makes those leaves sweeter. If you plant these different brassicas in the fall, you get much more frost and freeze exposure throughout the season. In the spring, you definitely still get some of this exposure. It's just not as prolonged. 2 reasons why brassicas do better in the cooler months. The first thing is brassicas, they can tolerate less sunlight than things that grow in the summer, which we'll get to in a future episode. But spring and fall vegetables, like their ideal amount of sunlight is going to be 6 to 8 hours a day. So in the spring and fall, we have limited or I guess less direct sunlight. If you're interested in learning more about sunlight and angles and seasons and all that fun stuff, go back to last week's episode. So episode 15, give that a listen. I go through all of the seasonal considerations for how we're moving around the sun and all that good stuff. So go back and give that episode a listen if you're interested. Another reason why they do so well is because their main pest concerns, not to get too, nitty gritty or scary, but, whenever we're growing plants, we're also cultivating an ecosystem. And part of that ecosystem is pests, bugs, insects. Sometimes these can be really great insects to have around, and sometimes they can be pretty irritating. So another reason why it's great to grow brassicas in the spring or fall is because this is when the aphids and the cabbage worms and the armyworms are all tucked in. They don't like the cold. They're not out. And so your plants are really given the freedom to thrive. Now, some of you might be wondering, okay, well, what does an aphid look like? Or what's the deal with a cabbage worm or an armyworm? These are your most common pests or insects, bugs to keep an eye out for as the temperatures start to increase. So as we are moving towards spring and everything is coming alive and we're seeing buds on all the trees, this also means that all of the bugs are starting to awaken and they're hungry. They're looking for snacks. So aphids are soft-bodied insects and they usually travel in mass. So if you see one aphid, it usually means you have multiple aphids, and they like to live underneath the leaves closest to the soil. So as we start to move towards like days with highs in the 50s or 60s, just start like keeping your eyes peeled for aphids. Same goes for the cabbage worm. Now, the cabbage worm is a caterpillar, and it's the juvenile cabbage moth. So if you see any moths with white wings, you might want to keep your eyes peeled for the cabbage worm. And the cabbage worm is a sneaky little worm. Usually they are the same color as cabbage leaves. They blend right in. It can be really difficult to find them. So if you start seeing weird holes that weren't there before, could be a cabbage worm. Now, armyworms have very similar behavior, but they look a little different. They have dark brown bodies with like a yellowish stripe that runs down the back, but they come out around the same time as the cabbage worm, and they have very similar like eating habits and eating preferences. So those are your main like pest concerns when it comes to the brassicas. Phew, we'll get that one out of the way. Now, I say that there are some pest concerns, but there's also great potential for using some of the members of the brassica family as companion plants. Now, companion planting is when you sow a particular plant next to another one to reap a certain benefit. So you could companion plant, let's say, marigolds in the summertime to sit next to your tomatoes to help keep the deer away. Or you could plant radishes or arugula or horseradish in and amongst your other plants, especially if you have issues with deer or squirrels or possums or raccoons, or some members of the brassica family have this pungent, mustardy, spicy smell, which can help to repel critters of various sizes and shapes. Oh, also, I just found out in preparation for this episode, you guys, always learning something new. That's why plants are so cool. Sweet alyssum is one of my most favorite flowers to use with companion planting. The blooms are edible. They're really precious. They smell so good too. Really, really sweet. And they're super teeny tiny. They form in like these little clusters that look like snowballs. And the plants themselves are kind of compact, but then they like to spew over edges, and they make really lovely like container additions, or like if you're going to do something fun with a hanging basket and some lettuce, or I don't know, sweet alyssums are just wonderful. But you guys, sweet alyssums are a member of the brassica family. It's a must as a companion plant. Sweet alyssum also attracts hoverflies, which is a natural predator for aphids. So plant you some sweet alyssum. Before you plant, there are some considerations just to keep in mind when it comes to brassicas. To make sure that the soil that you're using has a solid nitrogen content. Why is this important? Well, nitrogen is one of the macronutrients that all plants need. Plants especially need nitrogen when they're just wee little babies. Nitrogen is important because it helps to encourage photosynthesis. So it helps to feed and to support all of the green parts of the plant. So as you can imagine, if we're eating arugula, right? If we're eating kale, if we're eating collard greens, we really want those dark leafy parts of the plant to be supported. A really easy way of adding nitrogen to your soil is just to get some well-cured compost. This could be compost you made yourself. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I have an episode all about composting at home. So feel free to check that out. But it can be homemade compost. It can be store-bought compost. Two of my favorite store-bought composts are going to be earthworm castings and mushroom compost. So on like a pre-existing soil, I would do like 1 inch of worm castings or the mushroom compost on top of the soil and then mix it in. If you've got a little trowel or you're just going to get your hands in there and turn it. Now, if you are using fresh soil, so let's say you just built your raised bed and you filled it with a soil that already has mushroom compost in it, or maybe you're working in containers and you have like fresh bagged soil, make sure you use high quality bagged soil. I'm sensing an episode all about soil in my near future. But yeah, if you're using a fresh soil or if it's a new soil, you most likely won't need to amend your soil with additional nitrogen or compost this season. Now, ongoing or in future seasons, you can add a little bit more compost to help reinvigorate the nitrogen content in the soil. But most store-bought soils are going to come already chock full of nitrogen. I will say that it is possible to have too much nitrogen in your soil. So a little bit of compost goes a long way. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, making sure you've got a great nitrogen supply in your soil is really important before you go to plant your brassicas. Now, I said plant, but you can either sow brassicas directly, plant a little seed, or you can use transplants, depending on which varieties or which crops you are growing for that season. So for the most part, if I feel like I have enough time to direct sow, that is plant a seed in the space, in the soil where it's going to live its whole life, then I do. And there are some of these brassica family members that grow really quickly. Radish is one of the fastest growing vegetables that we can plant at home. So I almost always will direct seed the radishes that I want to grow. I usually do arugula from seed. Bok choy, oh my gosh, bok choy again is like lightning fast. I feel like I plant the seeds and then the next week I come out and they're already 1 inch tall. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys are great. Yeah, I would also do turnip from seed. So turnip and radish, those are root vegetables, obviously, right? The main part of the plant that we eat is the root. And I do know some people who transplant turnips. I also know people who transplant like beets and carrots. And by all means, if that works for you, then have at it. I'm always a little hesitant to transplant. And by transplant, I just mean move a plant that's already growing from its existing container to another spot. I'm always a little hesitant to do that with root vegetables because in that process of moving from one patch of soil to the next is root stress. And if I'm cultivating the root, then I really want that root to stay nice and strong and happy. And so usually I just direct seed any root vegetables. And turnips and radish grow really quickly. Most radish varieties are like less than 30 days from like germination or when the seed sprouts until when you can harvest it. Most turnips are probably in like the 40 to 50 day range. And to put that into perspective, Brussels sprouts are like, at least 90 days. So in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty fast. Bok choy as well is like less than 30 days. If you're growing any mustard greens, your collard greens, your kale, kohlrabi, those you can really do either from seed or using a seedling or a transplant. So those crops from the time your seed germinates until the time you usually get a first harvest is between 50 and 60 days. The members of the brassica family that take the longest to grow are going to be your broccoli, your Brussels, your cabbage, and your cauliflower. Like I said, with the Brussels sprouts, those take over 90 days to grow from start to finish. What I have found, and again, like the more you practice growing food at home, the more you're going to find what's going to work for you, what's going to work for your space. What I have found is that I enjoy growing these bigger plants that take longer to mature in the fall, more so than the spring. Because in the spring, for me, I'm looking for things that are going to grow quickly and I can get, a couple of rounds of harvesting in before it's time to pull out those plants and plant summer stuff, right? And then summer things grow all through the crazy heat and then get pulled usually around the end of August when they're all tired. And it's like, who isn't tired come August? I tell you. That's usually when I pull those plants and then I plant for fall. And fall is such a beautiful time of year, just like period, but also because it gives you that extension. The next time there's a big push to plant anything is spring. I usually like to plant those bigger, longer days to maturity crops in the fall. That said, I am a cabbage fiend and I try to plant as much cabbage as I possibly can. So I usually try to sneak in a few spring rounds of cabbage. Let's talk about space, right? These bigger plants that take longer to grow, like your broccoli, Brussels, cabbage, cauliflower, those 4 are also your largest edible members of the brassica family. Obviously, being the largest, they take up the most amount of space. Those 4 plants, your broccoli, Brussels, cabbage, cauliflower, are going to need 2 to 3 feet of space between one another. If you have ever seen one of these plants grow, that will make a lot of sense because they get real big. And the part of these plants that we actually eat is the flowering head of the plant. So the little bud of the plant before it blooms. So broccoli florets, a head of cauliflower, each little Brussels sprout, and the cabbage, those are all buds of the plant. And if you were to leave them longer on the plant, they would bloom into those beautiful cruciferous flowers, usually in a bundle of cruciferous flowers. They're really pretty, but of course, that's not what we want. We want to eat them when they're still just heads, when they're still just the buds of the plant. But to support that production, they need really, really big leaves. And it takes a lot of energy from the plant to produce those heads. If we want to get down to the nature of it all, what the plant is trying to do is to create its seed before it dies so that its genetics can live on. These plants are really big because they're taking in all of this energy to create this head. They'll be full of seed. Now, if you're growing in containers, or even if you just have one raised bed or like 2 small raised beds, take into account the dimensions and plan accordingly when it comes to broccoli, Brussels, cabbage, and cauliflower, because in an ideal situation, they will have 2 to 3 feet of space between one another. And the reason why spacing is so important, it helps to increase airflow. It helps all of your plants get equal access to sunlight. So access to sunlight and airflow help to reduce the amount of pests and disease in and around your plants. So keep that in mind. If you have smaller spaces that you're working with and you really want to maximize the yields, I would hands down recommend those crops that grow really quickly that are part of the brassica family. So your arugula, your bok choy, and your radish. Radishes only need 1 inch or 2 between one another to thrive. That would be their ideal spacing. Bok choy is like a little baby cabbage. It needs a little bit more space, maybe like 4 to 6 inches, but again, grows really quickly. And then arugula is great. Arugula can be seeded really densely, and arugula is a cut and come again. I'm using air quotes, but of course you can't see those. Is a cut and come again crop, meaning once it is of harvestable size, which is usually like 6 to 8 inches tall, you can come in and you can just cut the whole patch down, literally the whole patch. And, you want to leave like maybe 2 to 3 inches of arugula stem above the soil, and it'll regrow. And then you can come in and you can cut it again. Yeah, you can cut as much as you want, pretty much as often as you want, as long as it's of the right size. So those 3 would be superb for small spaces. Also, with your bok choy and your radish, you get 1 harvest of those per plant, right? So you harvest a radish, you pull the whole plant out of the soil. That plant is done growing for you. You're going to eat it now. And once you harvest a radish, you can just pop another seed right in its place and let it grow again, because they grow so fast. So those are the 3 that I would say would be best for small spaces. My next choices for small spaces are going to be collard greens and kale. And the reason for that is because, like arugula, collard greens and kale are also cut and come again, but in a different way. You can come back to the same kale or collard plant over and over again and just take leaves. I will say that it is important, especially with your kale and collards, it is important to be patient and let your baby plants grow to a certain size before you start harvesting. So when you harvest from collard green and kale plants, it's a form of pruning because you're pinching off leaves, you're pulling, pieces of the plant off. And just like with pruning, when we do that, it causes the plant to have a little bit of shock. It's a little jostling. And the more established the plant is before you start harvesting, plus the bigger the plant's leaves are that you leave on the plant that you're not harvesting, then the easier it is for that plant to rebound and to produce for you again. I usually try to wait to harvest my kale and collard greens until I'm seeing like 4 or 5 like open hand sized leaves on the plant. And once the plant is about like 12 to 18 inches tall. Once I have roughly both of those characteristics, then I start harvesting. And when you harvest your kale and your collard greens, it's important to just take a few per plant. You don't want to strip down a whole little plant, just leave like 3 leaves right at the tippy top of the plant. You want to spread the love and make sure your plants have time to rebound or catch back up once you've essentially pruned them. One more thing on harvesting kale and collards, just because it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, but it works. So when you're harvesting, I see this all the time and I gently correct it. Don't leave a little nub on the plant where you harvested. If you're going to take a leaf off of the plant, snap it from the very base of the stalk. Don't leave like an inch or 2 on the main part of the plant, because what the plant is interpreting in you doing that is that there's still something out there. There's still a leaf out there that the plant needs to maintain. And if the plant thinks that it has a leaf to maintain, it's going to be sending energy to this little nub and not to the big, beautiful leaf growing from the side of the plant that could be growing bigger and bigger for you to harvest. When you harvest your kale and collards, snap the leaf clean off of that main stalk, and that will make for many more harvests for you. Now, if you have listened to this podcast before, then you'll know that at the end of every episode, I share just a fun fact that's not really related to the episode itself. It's just a fun plant fact or piece of advice or tidbit or a little morsel of information to sign off on. So I'm going to share with you a little fact about avocados. So Marshall, my wonderful partner, he got me a calendar that's all about pollinators. And honestly, I'll probably be sharing every fact on this calendar with you all in this podcast this year because I'm obsessed with pollinators. So this month, the image on the calendar is really cute. It's a bunch of honeybees and avocados and avocado flowers. And there's a little blurb on the bottom of the calendar page. And here's your fun fact. Our avocado trees have both male and female flowers. It's not good for one tree to pollinate and produce fruit with itself. You don't get a whole lot of genetic diversity there, which can not be super sustainable for the species itself. So what the little avocado trees do is they coordinate when the male flowers of one tree will open and the female flowers of another tree open, so that as the pollinators are landing and moving from tree to tree, it helps to ensure genetic diversity from the little honeybee or whatever pollinator is coming along. So that is your fun fact today about avocados. So this year I wrote an entire planning calendar called Growth. It's filled with 52 weeks of intentions, reminders, and advice for growing food at home in 2024. I will put a link to this in the show notes. And if you are interested in grabbing my calendar, it's just $35. And it's a digital resource where you'll be able to receive a weekly intention, a weekly reminder, or piece of advice from me throughout all of 2024. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Growing Space podcast. I hope you enjoyed all of the content that was shared and that you're leaving today's episode with some new information to take to your very own growing space. As I mentioned throughout the show, more information is tucked into the show notes. If you look below the episode on whatever platform you are listening to this episode on, you will find those show notes linked below for your continued learning and education. I hope you tune in to next week's episode. I release new episodes every Tuesday. We'll see you again next week.